Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Wallace Klinck.
Hi there, Andy. We just seem to be going through a beautiful period right now. We got things are green, the flowers are out, and the weather is quite nice. We got a little bit of rain and warms up. And we did have a day that was 31 or 2 degrees there a while ago, which is a little
Okay,
on the hot side
yeah,
for us.
that's excellent. That's good news, Wally. And the reason why Robert and I were both smirking away there was because I always introduce Robert first, but I chose to do something different today. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Right? And you almost got away with it. Wally was a bit hesitant in responding, wasn't he?
He was.
Anyway, good to see you again, Arnie. It's always a pleasure to
No worries.
be
Ple-
involved in these talks.
Pleased to have you, Robert. The subject for today, the Final Treason. This is 13, Series 13 in the Final Treason. I want to cut across to a website, and this one in The Lancet. The Lancet is an online medical journal, and it's got here in regard to the unprecedented global social and economic crisis triggered by COVID-19, and in particular, this article is in regard to children and the morbidity of children as a consequence of the COVID policy, if you like, the lockdown policy. It really is important to take a step back from the situation and think, okay, we're in lockdown, people are isolated, and there is a certain amount of mortality tied in with COVID. But at the same time, what about the collateral damage? Now, we hear that. I think Madeleine Albright was famous for saying 500,000 children in Iraq was an acceptable collateral damage. Well, this here is saying that similar numbers around the world as a consequence of COVID. Schools are in certain communities, schools are very important because they are or could be impoverished people. And the schools actually make a point of feeding the children. So the children get at least one meal a day. And if they don't attend school, then they may even miss out on that one meal a day. And so it becomes a hidden, if you like, mortality if they die from starvation. It's not part of the COVID statistics saying the policy might be saving so many, but it's actually killing others. Now in Australia, in Melbourne at the moment, it's gone to stage 4 lockdown. And the way I read the announcements on it, you can't leave your home unless it's absolutely vital. And they're going to hold this lockdown for 6 weeks, I think it is. 6 weeks. So you're essentially under house arrest. Now that means that you're not going to visit your neighbour, you're not going to visit your loved ones. You might have a granny that's there on her own, and she has to stay isolated. You have to stay isolated. And the fact is that she could pass while you don't see her, unless you're able to keep in contact with the phone or the internet or whatever. But you don't know the stress and the strains that isolated person is under. It becomes collateral damage. It really is important to think about this. And it's also important in this sense that are we actually doing the right sort of thinking here? Or are we actually following the leader? That our leaders present something and it sounds reasonably viable. It sounds like it's a realistic solution, a realistic answer to a perceived threat. But should we actually be listening to our leaders, or should we actually be making our own minds up and actually doing some homework in order to try and decipher what is going on? In my view, it's something that we should be looking to decipher, but that's only my view. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, what did our leaders tell us back, I guess, in March? That they were going to have a shutdown for 2 weeks, and people trusted them. I don't think that's what they had in mind at all, because the 2 weeks has turned into more like 5 months now, I think. And the original pretext was that the population had to be protected, their health had to be protected, so they had to go into some kind of isolation and take protective measures so that they wouldn't be infecting each other with this alleged virus. And then we were told that the real purpose of this shutdown was to protect the health system. because if there was a huge number of people flooding into the hospitals at once, then these hospitals would be overwhelmed and they wouldn't be able to function. Well, in fact, that never happened. And I happened to go to hospital 3 times during this period. And I'm telling you, there was nobody there. I was astonished. I wasn't going to go initially because I thought, well, they're overworked, but I did have to go. I went, and I went 3 times, and every time the emergency ward at least was empty. Astonishing. I've never seen a hospital so inactive. But after they told us that they were taking steps to save the health systems, we learn that actually what they're doing is planning what they call a great reset. So I suspect that this was the original intention from the start. And they lied to us about the projected duration of the shutdown, the collapsing of the economy. And now they are intending to redesign society from the base up, and nothing will be as it used to be. They're planning a great reset that is going to affect every aspect of our lives. And what we've seen so far is not very promising. So putting your trust in these leaders is a very risky business, I'm afraid, because you don't know what influences they're actually subject to. You know, you're not privy to who is exerting influence on them, who is pressuring them, who is feeding them information. And therefore they are manipulable, but they are not candid with the public because, well, for one thing, they have contempt for the public. I worked in a political context for a long time, and I heard members of parliament say, the public are just little children. And if that's your attitude toward the public, then you're not going to be confiding into them and asking for their input into the decisions that are going to be made. So, as you say, Arnie, this business of leaders is a critical one that people have to get their heads around and clarify.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. You reminded me of a couple of points in that. One was you talked about the changing goalposts, that it was to protect the public, and then the next narrative that comes out is to protect the health system. And of course, there's going to be other narratives that come out. And if you take a step back and you place yourself under the discipline, if you like, of the propaganda of climate change, originally it was global warming. Global warming, the Earth was warming, and if it wasn't held within 1 degree or 2 degrees maximum, then there was going to be all sorts of catastrophic events. And of course, those events, the melting of the ice caps, the rising of the sea levels, the crop failures, all of these events. And of course, after a while, the narrative began to wane. And as it was waning, it went from global warming to climate change. And now it's variability, storms or fires or whatever. I know that this year in Australia, the fires, certainly they're not unprecedented, but the fact is that the fuel load was, if you like, in my view, negligent, criminal negligence on the behalf of the authorities who didn't insist that the fuel load was actually burnt in the cooler months so that we wouldn't have the fires. The point I'm getting at in this whole discussion is that the narrative changes, and it changes to maintain a position of, if you like, concern or fear. And we're not actually breaking the cycle. We're not breaking the cycle. So relying on our leaders is not working. All we're doing is being subjected to further and further indoctrination and manipulation. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
I think our leaders are pretty skittish about taking any kind of a position on these things because they're primarily in there to to maintain their positions and look forward to some improvements in their own personal positions if they're successful in their careers. I think myself, I am not at all convinced that the fires up at Fort McMurray in Alberta here were entirely spontaneous. I don't think that they were, but I understand that it's still under investigation, but it might remain under investigation for eternity. It seems odd to me that they would. It seemed to be sort of a precursor to all of this other stuff that sort of reached a culmination of crises one after the other. And it was aimed, obviously, it had the effect of really destroying the oil industry up in that territory, which of course goes right along with the radical program of sabotage of the modern industry as such. They're not interested in improving the plight of the population. They're interested in enhancing centralized power as a control mechanism over society. And they use guilt as probably the primary inducement to get cooperation from the public, and fear. So I really think that this whole thing does fit into a typical Marxist strategy for the essential destruction of the existing order and the replacement of it by their own conception of how things should be done. And the way they think things should be done is through centralized control. This is a destruction of initiative. And of course, it is guaranteed to ruin any economy, because a genuine burgeoning and successful economy depends upon initiative. It depends upon morale, depends on the willingness to invest. And without that, things just fall into decline. And then society becomes even more ripe for a Marxist takeover.
Mm. Thank you for that, Wally. That's quite a deep and challenging thought. But it also highlights to me that I think there's a saying, I think it's scriptural, that says something like, if the people have no vision, they will perish. And what we're seeing, what we're witnessing is that if you like, the revolutionaries certainly have a vision. The revolutionaries have been produced from our universities and sent out into the field, and they've gone right through the Western culture and subverted it. And of course, the if you like, the massive immigration programs that have gone to dilute, if you like, the historic cultures of the free-speaking people, the English-speaking people around the world, to the point where even their history is denigrated. So of course those as people are of the view that we really are worthless, we are useless, when in actual fact the greatest, if you like, frontier work, the most adventurous, the most scientific, the most creative, the most innovative, it's something to be proud of. It's something to be proud of. And the thing is that when you get to the stage where you're relying on the leaders, you're relying on your teacher, you're relying on your preacher to actually give you a heads up of what is, and they let you down because they happen to have revolutionary tendencies, you're lost. You're in no man's land. And so you've got to take a step back and think, well, okay, they've led me down the garden path. They've destroyed my, if you like, my resolve. And how do I actually regain it? How do I actually restore or place a vision in my mind of a society that is fair, equitable, and not revolutionary and not barbaric? And how do I do that? And the thing is, you've actually got to start from within. Solzhenitsyn said that. He said that the turning around from the mass slaughter of the Soviet, if you like, regime, the 100 and so plus years of Bolshevism in Russia, and of course the 70 years of communism in China. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of people. Hundreds of millions were slaughtered under these regimes. And that is the outworking of that type of thinking. This is where communism takes you. It takes you to a position of power. The administration exerts all power. Their demonstrations every year in Moscow and Peking are always the same. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, tanks, ships, aircraft, troops armed to the hilt. All about exerting power and influence, whether it's over a neighbour or it's over their own population. That's not the answer to civilization. Might is right. We've got weaponry now developed that can obliterate entire cities. They can obliterate it. This is not where we want to go. We want to actually start to think and say, okay, man has got to that point where he can exert so much destructive power. We've got to actually pull back. We've got to actually consider the role of leadership, and probably the most important leadership or lack of leadership is that little voice within. It's personal leadership. It's personal responsibility and accountability. We've actually got to turn and face ourselves on this and ask the question, am I so indifferent that the world will go to pot, that it will go to a world slave state? Or can I actually reorientate myself, think of others other than myself and my immediate gratification, think of my future progeny, think of the culture that I inherited. Am I actually within me? Do I have the capacity to consider things and take that culture forward? I believe we have, but it's something that's dormant, and it has to be, if you like, resurrected. Phoenix, brought back from the dead. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, young people have had their thought processes adversely affected by their education. And, there was a time when people grew their own food, they had their gardens, they had their own animals, and they were relating to things in a realistic way. And it would never have occurred to the people who were doing that the whole history of the world and everything that has happened that's important in the world is a result of class conflict. But Marx came along and he said that the history of the world is the history of class warfare. And for the Marxist, this is really all that exists. And that's why we have all these young people who are out in the streets demonstrating. I've noticed, in fact, that a lot of the demonstrations of Black Lives Matter in the United States don't have very many black people in them. They're all, university students, and many of them white. And it's because their thinking has been funneled into this really unrealistic and deadly for progress idea of class war. Now, that's not the way the world has evolved. The world has evolved by the accretion of knowledge and, steady improvement of existing processes. It's evolved by better understanding of human relations. It isn't a matter of constant conflict. And if you put the idea out that everything, in order to progress, you have to go through conflict, which is the idea of the dialectic, you've got the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis as a result, and this is how progress occurs. But it isn't how most progress occurs at all. And so young people have to be liberated from this really highly restricted. It's a limited an idea of very limited application. And it's very important that young people get to realize that all the good things we see around us are not the result of conflict. They're the result of cooperation and the accumulation of knowledge. It's a cultural heritage, and we want to preserve that cultural heritage. We don't want to abandon it for the sake of having some big class war in the future. So this is something that's been done to people, and we've entered into what has been called a post-fact world because of it. People used to be in contact with real things, and therefore they were accustomed to fact. But now in the theoretical world of the universities, you don't meet much of that. And they can take you further and further into abstract thinking and further from reality. And also, there's been a preparation for this in the encouragement of people to judge everything on the basis of their personal emotional reaction to it. Well, this takes you away from reality. too, because reality is outside your emotional reactions. Reality is something that you have to study and learn from. And so we have in the universities this inculcation of the idea that people are being triggered and they're being offended, and this is intolerable. Well, if reality is offending you, that's just too bad. You'd better accommodate yourself to reality, because that's the way to go. It's not to try to subvert reality. You can't do it anyway because you have some sort of emotional reaction going on. So this is a big challenge, because there's been decades of subversion of the thinking of young people through the educational process. And it would be good if they had some practical experience so that they became immune to this abstract theoretical thinking that leads them to focus on conflict and class war.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's interesting word you used just near the end there, and that was the immunity. And of course, under the threat of COVID-19, immunity is a very relevant point. If you're interested in developing your immunity, there are things that you can physically do about it. You can, for instance, eat garlic, or you might stimulate your immune system by having vitamin C supplements. As I understand it, in regard to the types of SARS-2 viruses, you also need zinc and you also need vitamin D. Now, these are things that you can physically do to stimulate your immune system. You could also eat things like sauerkrauts and things like that to actually promote the microbiome in your gut, to actually clarify your brain, if you like, to feed your brain so that you can actually improve your cognizance. Now, these are biological things. These are physical things that you can do. If you're not interested, you're not drawn to facts, then I find it's beyond reason. It essentially is. It's beyond reason. How could you not think about facts? How could you not actually try and process something that is true? I mean, if you put your finger in the concept in your mind is, I'm not going to get burnt if I put my finger on this flame, because I can reason it in my head, because I can visualize it, and therefore it's not going to happen. And of course, you put your finger in the flame and you get burnt. You get tested in your, if you like, defiance of the natural world. And this is what we're experiencing. We're actually experiencing, if you like, a cultural defiance against the natural order of things, the relationships of people, the relationships coming into community, the relationship between the individual, the community, and their representative or government and the bureaucracy. We're actually defying the natural order, and that's why we've got the lockdown. That's why we've got such autocratic governments, autocratic bureaucrats, the influence that we have over us. I want to touch on just a couple of things. I'm going to cut across to a website just to touch on, then I'll give you the floor, Wallace. The first one is I've just got to cut across. The first one is Natural News, and it highlights in the first article that Big Pharma achieves a total legal immunity for any vaccine that they produce for COVID. So that means that it doesn't matter whether it's got arms and legs and you mutate or you die, they're not actually held responsible for that. And I find that a disturbing situation. Now, what I just suggested to you with vitamins, I'm not aware that anyone gets side effects from taking them. I'm not aware of it, and I don't see any articles anywhere about it. And yet, here it is, you can take a vaccine, and they need legal immunity in order to sell this vaccine. And the other one was the front page of the Australian, which is, if you like, the major paper in Australia. And all it is about either two things. It's either about COVID-19 or it's about China. All right? It seems as if we have gone to a totally Bolshevik state in Australia. It looks as though there is nothing to talk about except the lockdown, COVID, and what is good for China. It's absolutely extraordinary that's the nature of where we are in Australia. And when you think about what can you do, what can you personally do to mitigate against COVID. What can you do? There are things that you can do. You choose to. We talked about leadership. Why is it really important to actually stop where you're going, relying on someone else, and start thinking for yourself? It really, really is, if you like, mob mentality. And as a youngster, if you're in the crowd and the crowd is doing something wrong, the crowd is doing something destructive. If you're in the armed services and the other troops are doing something and you get caught up in it, you're held accountable. Same with the community. You're held accountable. It's the individuals who face trial if they're doing something wrong. But you can get caught up in the crowd, and the thing is you have to resist that. That's the very part, if you like, of self-maturing, of personal development, of choosing not to be part of the crowd, but to stand apart from the crowd. This is, to me, is a very important time in our cultural history, our personal history, and, if you like, the individual history that you're making as we speak. Are you going to be part of this crowd, or are you going to set yourself apart and start thinking? Your thoughts, please, Wally Klinck.
Well, I don't necessarily go along with everything the Rebel, our independent news chain out here. Well, it's from the East now, too, but it's kind of Western originated, I believe. And they go out and to these sites where there are demonstrations going on by these people who are fighting the system and opposing virtually every aspect of our civilization. And they will attempt to interview some of these people. And, it's really, really startling. It's upsetting, but it's also revealing to watch the interactions that go on. These people will sometimes stress that they have a university background and with the implication that they know best. But when you listen to them, the way their responses, their emotional responses and their intellectual responses to questions, it becomes obvious that they are essentially on a one-way track where their thoughts are channeled. And I don't think that they are capable of looking from one side to the other and seeing alternative explanations or techniques or strategies or, explanations as to why things are happening in the world the way they are. They do not seem to be very creative. They give the impression of being automatons who are programmed to respond primarily to the proposition that's put before them that a free society is an exploitative society. It's one where the bad capitalists are exploiting everyone. And that they, of course, are the recipients of the discrimination that they complain about. But their position is so irrational. In the first place, it is our system, which is definitely not perfect, but it's our system which over time has brought about the level of development and so on, which has given us the abundance that we do have access to, not financially, but through debt. So it's really kind of instructive to watch these people respond and react when they're challenged to explain the why of something. They just don't seem to be. And another thing, they do not seem to be overly literate. I think it must be an area that is being sadly neglected in academia. And their responses, their behaviors definitely depict hostility. And I don't really know if any of them are qualified to do anything terribly constructive in the world, except destructive criticism and actions which are disruptive to a proper functioning productive system. So it's obviously that they have been subject to I would say, an intensive program of deprogramming and reprogramming in the revolutionary mode. And we have seen in the past, I guess it's hard for some of us to realize that we've gone through a period in the last century where I thought maybe the frailties or the failures of the command economy and were pretty well demonstrated. But a lot of the young people today apparently have not been subject to the experience of living through those days. And they have been, however, subject to the business of living through the intervening period, where they have been subject to enormous propaganda and programming themselves. So it looks as though the communist thing, but the thing of it is to note, I don't think most of these people really understand Marxism at all. I don't think they know what it's all about. I doubt if any of them can give you a disciplined, well, many of them could give you a disciplined critique, positive or negative. They are simply filled with an emotional animus, a hostility, which is concerned to break down, tear down, destroy, with really nothing constructive to replace it with, except the idea of equality. The idea of equality as being some kind of an antidote to exploitation. And exploitation seems to be, in their mind, almost automatic when anybody does anything constructive that shows actual results, because it is assumed that when anyone does anything to profit themselves, they're automatically doing it to exploit other people and society in general, which is not a very complimentary commentary on human nature and purpose. It's a rather degraded concept, and I think an unfair concept, because I think a lot of people have, in fact, sacrificed a great deal, or if they really enjoyed what they were doing, maybe you shouldn't call it sacrifice, but they've been creative and they brought about the possibility of a living standard that has been heretofore unknown, actually, in human history, except that it has been done at the cost of sort of a frenetic economy where people are running faster and faster in order to keep up with their debts and obligations, in order to obtain a lot of these things, which is not necessary because they're already produced and they're paid for. They should be having automatic access to a lot of the production that takes place. And they should be having to work only for what is necessary. They should automatically come by way of the rest of it, by way of inheritance. And so we are in a real mess. We're faced with a situation where we can have a truly abundant and civilized and cultured and leisured life, whereas we are being sabotaged right, left, and center by unrealistic policies. For instance, I understand in Australia that in Melbourne now they've gone into a very, very disturbing pattern of disrupting people's lives and so on, which will certainly not help the standard of living in that area or anywhere else where it's being done. It's really quite disturbing.
Thank you for that, Wally. And yes, you're exactly right. I'm just going to cut across to that website and just go through the lead articles in the Australian. All of it's about COVID-19, except for a bit of sport. But essentially, this is the main issues that are covering the main paper, and it's showing you pictures there. It's just empty streets, a city of 5 million and empty streets. And of course, the consequence of something like that is that people are not working. I personally know people in Victoria, and they're not working. Their businesses are shut down. They're in no man's land. Their staff do not know what's going on. And the thing is that their future is not clear at all. Now, mortgages are due. The overheads for running the business are due. The staff, if they're not being paid, how are they even surviving? They're going to the government cap in hand. And of course, similar to education loans, these things will probably have to be paid back by the individuals receiving them. So it's actually imposing further and further debt. And it's a very important strategy of, if you like, subduing a people is to enslave them through debt. And this debt enslavement is not new. This debt enslavement has gone on for thousands of years. And it's we've got to recognise that what are the real options for COVID-19? The real options are manage your immune system. That's the first option. That's the first realistic option. If you're concerned for elderly people in nursing homes, then manage their immune system. Give them vitamin therapy, give them garlic, give them all the supplements that they need, clean water, fresh air. These are the very things that they need. And part of course, managing the well-being of anyone is to engage with other people. They need visitors. They need visitors. And this isolation is compounding the situation. We talked about the shutting down of the schools in some third world countries where the children won't even get that one meal a day. So it's very, very important to look at the collateral damage on this. Okay, and the collateral damage, not just economic, but personal. And of course the morbidity. Think about such sad situations as people suffering that they've suicided or that they've prematurely died, unnecessarily died, just through sheer loneliness. I know I've read books on the prisoner of war camps in Korea, run as part of the Chinese, if you like, support for North Korea at the time. And when a person loses the will to live, they just curl up in a ball, and within a day or two they die, and there's nothing physically wrong with them, but spiritually they just die. And we've got to consider that these peripheral damage, these collateral damage that's going on with people in the community, and it's not taken into account. It's not. And I think we've seriously gone the wrong way. And of course, with the indemnity of the vaccines, and by the look of it, you won't be allowed out of your home unless you have one. So on that basis, the active Marxists, if you like, the revolutionaries in the streets that are supporting this whole situation, they are doing the work of big money. They are doing the work of big money. This is where communism and capitalism comes together. The street people who think they're off on some sort of emancipation, and they're not. What they are part of the collateral damage. They are part of it. They're just being used up, and they'll be spat out. And what's the first thing that happens when the communists take charge of a country is they liquidate all those who thought that this was going to be something completely different and say, no, this is a power movement and that's all it is. And you get your highfalutin ideas away about equality and all that. There's no such thing as about equality. We're the leaders. We've got the guns. You do as you're told, or your history. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Yeah, well, the collateral damage, I think of the little children. You know, they're putting masks on little 3 and 4-year-old kids, and this has got to be psychologically damaging. This is going to affect their perception of life for the rest of their lives. I don't understand how parents could be induced to do this. I guess if they think they're protecting the health of the kids, they do that, but surely they realize that the secondary effects are going to be ruinous. And as you mentioned, Arnie, the people in the old folks' care homes, I mean, surely many of these people are actually being killed because they've taken all the pleasure out of their lives, all the anticipation of a visit from their relatives, which is really all they looked forward to in many cases. They have nothing to look forward to now. And therefore, as you say, they can just fade away and die because there's no point in living if there's no pleasure in living, right? So this Melbourne situation, it seems to me that it is patently ridiculous. What is the benefit of having a curfew from 8 o'clock in the evening till 5 o'clock in the morning? What does that do? I just don't understand how people could say that somehow this is going to be a benefit in controlling the spread of the virus, because it just doesn't make any sense. If they are going to insist on the social distancing and the masks, well, they can argue that, I guess, but I don't think a curfew can be sustained logically in any way. And so you've mentioned that people should be building up their immune systems. Well, there are other suggestions that have been made, but we see no official investigation of alternative ways of dealing with this situation. And I know I got an email from a fellow in the Philippines, and he said that in the SARS alleged epidemic, for years they've been trying to dramatize these events, and they've petered out. They never amounted to anything. But in this case, they seem to be controlling the media to such an extent, and the politicians to such an extent, that they can make it look as though there's a real danger from the virus. But this fellow from the Philippines said in the SARS case, there was a much higher percentage of the population in China that were affected than were in the Philippines. And he said, there's got to be an explanation for this. And he suggested it could be coconut oil. Well, that's a possibility. I'm not saying it is, but shouldn't it be investigated? But the only hope that is held out for humanity is the development of a vaccine. The only thing that can save us, even though we know that there are many measures we can take to improve our immune response to viruses and bacteria. So it's so obviously something that is being examined on a narrow basis. There is no attempt to a general consultation from experts. It's always one or two spokesmen who are telling everybody in the country what they have to do. They're not asking other professionals, even though there are many professionals who have dissented from the official approach to these things. But it's a controlled response, and you can see that it is manipulated, that it is not a genuine attempt to come up with the best answer for the circumstances that are being portrayed. And that makes you very suspicious of whether the circumstances are as they're being portrayed. I frankly think that when they're fiddling with statistics and they're attributing deaths to COVID just because the person had a symptom or two of COVID, that this discredits the whole scenario that's being presented to us. You don't have to falsify information if there is a genuine crisis. And in fact, you wouldn't want to, because then you give people a wrong impression of what's going on. So, yeah, I'll end on that. But this vaccine business is really quite disturbing, because they're rushing the vaccine. They've done experiments with vaccines, which they say they're going to be producing now for general distribution. And they had 50% of people, very healthy people, who had adverse reactions to these things. And yet they say they're going to give them to the entire population, to people whose health is compromised, and just doesn't make any sense. So there's some kind of a game being played here. And it's something that the population should be very wary of. And it's time, really, that they organized a resistance to it, because if it isn't done soon, we're going to be in a very serious fix.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm going to cut straight across to Natural News, and I'll highlight the first four articles. And I thought it was interesting in your discussion. Big Pharma immunity. Facebook is complicit by banning life-saving information to treat COVID. And Twitter, this is interesting, this one, Dr. Stella, this lady here, she was on with a team of doctors and she presented her findings having treated 300 plus patients with this particular, as part of an overall strategy, and she used this particular drug. And then the fourth article, Ohio reverses the ban on that particular drug and now says the medical choices are between patient and doctor. Now, the thing is that there's so much being thrown on its head here. Freedom of choice, in a sense of medical choice, has always been there, but then we lost it. Go back a bit and you say, when did we lose it? We lost it when they added fluoride to the water. Fluoride, unnecessary. It was only like 0.01 or 0.001 of the actual water supply affects young children. Only that such a small amount affects young children, and yet the entire water supply had this poison placed in it. So if fluoride was beneficial and reduced caries, okay, fine, you could as a parent choose it to have it applied for your child. But the rest of the population, mandatory medication. You see, we gave it up. We gave it up back then. And this has just been an encroachment to the point now where we've got essentially the medical mafia. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, let's be honest and candid about it, Arnie. People who are planners of other people's lives do not want choice. They want to constrict choice. They want to dominate the field, and they want to be the only source of whatever may be offered, because they're basically totalitarians. They're bullies who want to control humanity. And they have contempt for other people, not only contempt for their knowledge, but for their right to even pursue knowledge. They want things done their way. And so you know what you're dealing with. It's an old thing in human history, nothing new about it, and it raises its specter every so often to an alarming degree. And sometimes through history, people have had to simply rise up in opposition to it in order to preserve any kind of a reasonable lifestyle for themselves. So that's what you have. You have a totalitarian set of mind and mindset, which is being facilitated by different elements in society. The political regime facilitates it because it goes along with it. The point has been made that even in the medical field, certainly there's a strong incentive, and here you come to the question of the influence of money again, because the governments have offered large amounts of money to certain segments of the medical profession that are willing to go along with this. Now, I know that there are a lot of medical people who are not happy with it, but what can they do? They're controlled by their professional associations. They have to live like everyone else. And if you take a position that is not consonant with the establishment, you are potentially and very often practically risking your very means of subsistence or existence. And so a lot of people just cut their teeth and close their mouths and persist. But I think there are more and more people who are really getting fed up with it, because I think they can see that it's having a very damaging effect on society. It's having a damaging effect on the economy. And I think that the argument is getting to the point where it can only be made by force. And you can see that there's a tendency for force, compulsion, to be upheld as the only way of coping with these so-called crises. So we're dealing with a particular group of people who are conditioned and brainwashed into the idea that they maybe are obligated, and certainly that they have the right to control other people. And I think it's time they were disabused of that delusion, because they do not have that right. They have a right, there's the old saying, mind your own business. It's sadly in need of attention. And these people have to be given that message loud and clear. We appreciate the services that they offer. We're glad that they do this, but we're not going to become slaves in order to accommodate their dictatorial pronouncements and edicts.
Thank you for that, Wally. That was particularly well observed and well put. A good summary. A good summary. In all, that the individual has to choose to mind their own business, and in doing so, that means that you have to think for yourself. You have to educate yourself. You have to actually try and think this narrative through. When our leaders are not offering us actually solutions, but rather lockdown and more power to them, less freedom to you. Very good summary. Good effort today, blokes. I really enjoyed it. Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Thank you so much.
Nice to be with you, Arnie.
Thank you, Arnie.